Hey guys, so for this tutorial we're going to go over just some quick After Effects techniques, just kind of importing images, image sequences, some transition effects, and some keyframing effects to get things like text to move, and then we'll go over some layout techniques as well. So let's pop open After Effects. And when it opens up, you probably will get this pop up here. I just close out of this right away. So you'll end up with something like this. The first thing you want to do is create a new composition, which is basically your canvas or your video kind of preview, or what you're going to be working in. So we'll create new composition. And I always go with the standard 1920 by 1080, and then I use a frame rate of 30 frames per second. The duration, if you know what it's going to be before you start, you can set it. I'm just going to set this to 1 minute. And you can always make it longer afterwards if you need to. Just so you know, this is frames, seconds, minutes, and then the last digit is hours. And I usually leave the background color as black and then click OK. So that's created our kind of video area, which is where we're going to preview all of the things that we bring into our animation. And it's called Composition 1. And you'll notice it kind of created this little video file over here on the left. Down here is where we're going to start adding in all of our media, and over here is where we're going to start to sequence all of our media. And then these are a bunch of different effects that you guys can cycle through. We'll go over a couple of them, but not a ton. So let's import kind of our first animation. And I'm going to be using clips that were created from the both the Rhino tutorial that's posted and the Maya tutorials that are posted as well. So you guys can go through those to kind of catch yourselves up. I'll also make some of those files available to you if you need them to kind of work through this tutorial. So I'm going to double click over here to load some media. And I'm going to go to sort of our first animation that we created. And I'm going to go into that image sequence, and I'm going to import these as a PNG sequence so they come in as a playable video. Okay, you only need to select the first one. Make sure PNG sequence is checked. This might not say PNG, it might say JPEG depending on the type of image you rendered out. So I'm going to import that. And it's going to drop that PNG sequence into my library over here. Now it's not in the animation yet. You have to click and drag it down to this area to actually import it into the animation. You'll notice it pops up in the preview up here. So now it's loaded into our animation. Okay, you'll notice that it goes from 0 to 10 seconds. If I hold Shift and click and drag on this little time slider, it'll snap to the end. And you can also click and drag this and move it around anywhere along our 1 minute animation. I'm just going to set it at the beginning for now and just kind of have it hang out here. I'm then going to double click and bring in our next PNG sequence. So it'll be our subtraction animation. I'll bring in this, drag it down, and you notice it kind of plopped it right underneath the first animation, which isn't what we want. We don't want these playing simultaneously. We want one playing and then the next. So I'm going to click and drag this out, hold down my Shift button, and it's going to snap to the end of that first animation. So now one will play, and then the second will play. Okay. I'm going to double click again, and let's go back to our section cut animation. Click on the images, select the first, import, pull this down. This one was quite a bit longer. Again, I'm just going to pull it out and snap it. So I'm starting to develop this sort of sequence of animations. And I can start to push and pull these around depending on how I want to sequence them or what order I want to have them in. The next thing I'm going to do is pull in sort of just an image so you guys can see how that works as well. So I'm double clicking over here. And for this, I am going to go into one of the precedent studies. Let's see. There we go. So I'm going to load in one single image. You're going to notice I'm not going to have the sequence option checked. That way it just brings it in as a single image. So I'll import that. It's going to import it as an image up here. Okay. And I'm going to click and drag this down. What you're going to notice is that After Effects automatically plays the image through the whole animation. So you kind of have to pick and choose where you want that image to stop and start. So let's say I want to have this image sort of play at the beginning of my animation. So I might take my slider and put it at the 0-second mark. And then let's say I want this image to play for 8 seconds. I'm going to type in 8 seconds, hit enter. That'll jump my time indicator to 8 seconds, and then I can click and drag on the right end of my image sequence down at the bottom here. Hold shift, and it's going to snap that to our time indicator. So now that image is only going to play for 8 seconds. And then I can click and drag this up to the top. I like to arrange things so that things that are happening in the beginning are up at the top, and then as it moves through, everything's kind of layered like that. So then I'll take these 3 guys and snap it to the end of that. So right now I've got an 8-second image, and then an animation, another animation, and another one. Okay. So that's one way to sequence and edit an image. You can also click it. Right now it's not kind of full size. You can click and drag on these little boxes. You'll notice it allows me to scale it. You don't want to do that, so hold shift and it'll scale it uniformly. I might just have it show up a little bigger. Okay. Then the next thing I'm going to do is bring in some text. So let's say I want a little title screen at the beginning. Maybe it lasts for around 8 seconds. So again, I'm going to set my slider to 8 seconds. And I'm going to click all of these, hold down shift, select everything. I'm just going to click and drag it off to the end here. Okay, now I've kind of given myself a blank slate or a blank video for 8 seconds. So I can start to infill this with text. What I'm going to do is come up to the top here to my horizontal type tool, click it. I'm going to click and drag on my video canvas. What you're going to notice, it creates a new layer of text. Okay. And again, similar to the image, it automatically makes it play for the full length of the video. We don't want that. So I'm going to set my time indicator to 8. I'm going to click and drag on the end, hold shift, and snap it to that 8-second part. So now that text only plays for 8 seconds. To edit that text, I'm just going to double click on the layer down here. It's going to open up the text edit box. And you can start over on your right hand side. You've got character where you can change the text size, the font, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to set the font color to white and just call this, turn on my caps lock, Peter Eisenman animated massing. Okay. Once I've typed it, you can come up to your align tool and you've got all these align options. I'm just going to center this. You can't have your caps lock turned on while you're making edits. You won't be able to preview them. You'll get this little arrow down here, so I have to turn my caps lock off. And then I'm going to center it on the middle as well. So I just centered it this way and that way. And then you also have your paragraph edits too, where you can change, justifications and those kinds of things. So now I have sort of an intro title, an image of Peter Eisenman's massing model, and then I start to jump into the animation sequences that I've sort of created here. Okay. And it's sort of just those three. A couple of things that you can do, you can have two items on one screen play at the same time. So for example, if I wanted to bring in another image or diagram, let's say I grab this guy, import it, click and drag it down. I'm going to set it to be right underneath. Okay, I'm going to hold shift and click and drag the ends of that image time and snap it so it aligns. Then you'll notice up here I can click and drag these images around and sort of reorient them on this video. So I can select these and sort of scale them down or scale them up so they sort of fit on this page as two individual images. Okay, and then I'm going to go into my align tool. Now I can't really align them left and right, but I can align them up and down. So I'm going to select one and just click this little align at the middle tool for each one of these and just make sure they're aligned that way. And then you just kind of have to eyeball left and right. These look pretty close. I might bump this over just a little bit, give it some breathing room. Okay, but now these play simultaneously. You can do the same thing with videos. So if I wanted this animation and this animation to play at the same time, you could click and drag this over, snap it, and then click and drag this animation over to here, and then click and drag that animation over to here. Now obviously they have to get a little smaller to fit, so I'm going to select them both, grab one of these squares, hold shift, and click and drag them down. So now they play simultaneously. Okay, so that's another option for sequencing images. If there's a relationship you want to create between the two animations and you want them playing at the same time, that's also an option. Okay, you just kind of have to rearrange things and slide them around until you have the sequence that you want. Okay, so there's a lot that you can do just with those techniques. Let's go over some color editing and video editing real quick. So if I wanted to change the brightness and contrast or the levels, those kinds of things, I'm going to select this, go up to Effect, and then under Color Correction, you have all of these color editing options, and I can apply these to text, images, videos, anything that I've brought down into this animation area. So I'm going to grab, let's just say levels, so we can mess around with that a little bit. It's going to pull up the effect here, and then I can click and drag on levels. If I want to add a bunch of contrast, I can do that. If I want to make it really dark or a lot lighter, I can do that as well. And all of that stuff, again, that's just under your effects tab, color correction. So you have auto color, contrast, and levels. You have black and white, you have brightness, contrast, exposure, hue, saturation, levels. All of that stuff kind of lives in here. Okay. but I'm not really going to mess around with that stuff too much because I like the way these look as they are. Next, we'll go over some fading in and fading out. So let's say I want these images to fade in and fade out. Okay, so I'm gonna use my zoom in and out bar for my time slider up here just so I can zoom in on a clip of our animation. Just makes things a little bit easier. Notice right now there's a little bit of weird overlap between these things. See how they're not perfectly aligned? We can edit that real quick if we need to. I can set this directly to 8. And there's like a little bit of overlap. It's not a big deal. You can just kind of take this and re-snap it when you're zoomed in a little bit more, and now things are aligned a little bit better. Okay, so let's add a fade in and fade out to this first image. All right, what I'm going to do is come over here and pull down this little drop arrow. And then I've got this little transform tab. I'll pull down that arrow as well. Okay, what I've got here are my anchor point, which is where this point is relative to the image. I've got my position, which is where this point is relative to my video canvas. I've got scale, which is the scale or size of my image in the vertical and horizontal directions. These should always stay the same. If they're not the same, that means you're distorting your image in some way. You have rotation value, if I wanted to start to rotate the image. And you have opacity. Okay. So in order to fade in and fade out in After Effects, what we're going to do is key the opacity changing at the beginning of the animation and at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Shift and snap my slider or my time indicator to the beginning of this clip. And what I'm going to do is click this little watch. And that's going to create a keyframe at that moment. I want this to fade in, so at the beginning of this clip, I want my opacity to be 0. And then over the course of 1 second, so I'm going to take this, set it to 9, hit enter. I'm going to click and drag this up to 100. And the moment I change this number, it's going to add a keyframe. Okay, so now if I come back and I play this, it's going to fade that image in. Okay, and then for the end to fade out, I'm going to do the exact opposite. I'm going to set it to the end. I'm going to click and drag this down to 0. It's going to automatically add that key. Then I'm going to backtrack 1 second. So I'll set this to 15, enter, and I'm going to pull this up to 100. Okay, so now I've got 4 keys. At that moment, it's 0. At that moment, it's 100. It stays at 100 until it gets to this frame. And then between here and here, it's going to drop to 0. All right, so if I play that all the way through, tap the space bar, it's going to fade in. Hold at 100% opacity. And then fade out. Okay, and you can go through and do that to each one of these clips if you want to get a nice fade in and fade out technique. Okay, I might pull this down, pull down my transform, go to the beginning, key this, backtrack it to 0, put this to 9, 100, go to the end, backtrack it to 0, go to 15, and put this up to 100. All right, so now both of those should fade in and fade out. Fading in and fading out like that is a really nice transition effect. It just allows it so that your images and your videos aren't kind of jumping back and forth at each transition. It just makes it a little bit easier on the eye. So that's a good kind of transition effect to use. In terms of keyframing, that's really how it works. You just click this little blue watch. Anywhere you see this, it means that option is able to be keyframed. So you can keyframe the location of your image if you want it to move from left to right. I can, let's say I want this image to move from left to right. At the beginning, I can key the position, and then at the end, I can take that image and move it, and it's going to give me that arrow. And so now what's going to happen is, over time, and the minute I move that image, it automatically adds that keyframe, similar to changing the opacity. So now that image is going to move across, which can be an interesting effect. You know, you can have it move, or you can have it scale up or scale down to make it seem like you're zooming in and out of a photo. You can zoom really far in. So if, for example, I can take this, you know, one kind of cool effect is to make this really big. You start with it here, and then I might key this. So let's go into the options for that animation. Let's key the position here, and then by the end, let's track this upwards. We'll key it there. And then the animation is kind of this interesting zoom in, pan shot of that image. Okay. You need a pretty high res image to do that. You'll notice that when I make this image big enough to zoom in like that, it's going to get pretty blurry. So just make sure that if you're going to zoom into images, that they're of a really good quality. I'm just going to undo all that. So now I should just have a fade in, fade out. Okay. So that's basically how you keyframe things moving across. Now you can keyframe pretty much anything. Okay, text. Right, you've got your transforms under there. You've got a couple more options under text in terms of what you can scale, just by going to the menu down here. But yeah, really anything you pull down under this little arrow tab, all these transform tools, you can scale, you can keyframe. Let's see if there's anything else that's going to be helpful. You'll notice that now that I've got my sequencing kind of finished, my animation isn't quite as long, or it doesn't take up the whole time slider. You want to fix that before you send it out to render, because what's going to happen is if I send this out to render as it is, my video is going to play, and then it's going to have a couple seconds of black screen at the end, which you don't want. So usually what I do is I just set my time indicator at the very end, hold shift to snap it. And I'll probably give myself just like a second of breathing room. So right now it's a 46-second long animation. So I'm going to go up to my composition settings, and pull up that video again. And we're going to change this down here. Instead of 1 minute, it'll be 47 seconds. Click OK. And that'll give me just a quick little second at the end there. We can also go over some speeding up and slowing down techniques. Just because you render something out in Maya at a certain speed or certain frame rate doesn't mean it has to play that slow or that fast. You have a little bit of breathing room. Speeding up an object is much easier. All you have to do is right click, go to time, and go to time stretch. You can set a stretch factor, so this is a percentage, or you can do a new duration. So if I can set this to be, let's say I want it to play twice as fast, so it'll be 5 seconds long. So the stretch factor is 50%. Or if I wanted to play twice as long, I could set this to 20 seconds and it would play twice as long. Now, you can't slow it down too much, because if you slow it down below 24 frames a second, you're going to start to get a skipping effect, or it's going to start to look kind of blurry. After Effects, when things get too slow, will automatically try and blur the transition from one frame to the next frame so it doesn't look like it's skipping. But but you do get kind of a blurry kind of residual effect from that. So you can only slow down things so much, but you can speed them up as much as you want because you're only upping the frame rate at that type of edit. So that's where you can go in and change that. So if I change this to 5 seconds and click OK, it's going to shorten up that clip in my time slider because that's now playing twice as fast. Okay, I'm going to undo that. The other thing we can go over are different kinds of blending modes. So just like in Photoshop or Illustrator where you can have different blending modes between layers, you have that same option in After Effects. So let's say I wanted to change sort of the effect or look of this image by messing around with the blending mode. What I can do is I'm going to copy and paste this. So I'll do Control-C, Control-V. It's going to paste it right on top of itself. And then all of your blending modes are going to be under Layer, Blending Mode. And you're going to notice you have all these blending modes, and they're going to be really similar to what Photoshop and Illustrator have to offer. So you have Add, Lighten, Screen, Color Dodge, Darken, Multiply. All of those options live there. And then once you add it, it should be placed. I think it shows up somewhere. Yeah, there you go. So if we turn on the mode column, so I'm just going to right click, and under columns you have modes. That's your blending mode. So if it helps to turn on that column so you can see all the blending modes that are applied to this layer, you can check it. By default, everything's normal, and I just changed this one to multiply. So I can click this down and change it that way. Color burn, add, all these similar options that you should be familiar with in Photoshop exist here. Okay. So for example, if you go back to the tutorial, the intro to rendering tutorial, where I show you how to overlay an occlusion render on top of a textured or color render to kind of give it some higher contrast, using that sort of blending mode of multiply or overlay. That's where you would do the same thing. You can bring down two animations, one that is of color and one that is of your occlusion, and sort of overlay the two on top of each other to get a different kind of effect that way. So those are your blending modes. And then to get you out of After Effects and into a final movie that you can save, once your sequence is good to go and you've clipped your time slider down to the length that you need it to be, you're going to come up to, you can close out of this up here to get back to your kind of library of media. I'm going to click on composition 1, so I highlight that. Okay. Come up to composition, add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. That's going to open up our media encoder, and this is going to allow us to save this video out as a playable movie file that you can share, upload to social media, whatever. So if you click that in After Effects, this is going to pop up. Just give it a sec for your animation to pop up here. I'm going to click on this just to choose a place to save it. I'll throw it on the desktop, leave it as comp. You can rename it whatever you want. You want to make sure this says H.264. If it doesn't, click the down arrow and select it. And then under preset, you want to make sure you have high quality 1080 HD selected. And then once those are set, hit the play button up at the top. And that's going to start rendering out your final video. Okay, so that's finished. I can close out of the Adobe Media Encoder. I'm going to save my After Effects file, close out of that, and I've got this final playable video, which should be able to play on pretty much any computer you send it to. And you can kind of watch this thing go all the way through. What you're going to realize the first time that you play it is, how long things show up for. You'll notice 8 seconds to view 2 images is kind of okay, but 8 seconds to view 2 lines of text can be a rather long time. So it's going to take some time for you to get used to how long things should last for within your sequence. But the fade in and the fade out are nice techniques, and then you'll have your animations sequenced in there as well. So the kind of goal is, mix and match. It doesn't have to be sequenced, in order from text to images to animations. You can have images on one side while animations play on the right. There's a lot of different sequencing options that you can produce and mess around with. Yeah, that's all I'm going to show you guys for this.